My name is Chuck.
And I'm Dave Clement, and today we're going to be talking to you about the importance of open source visibility for security teams using GitHub, Microsoft Azure Repos, and Trend Micro. So we know that the speed and veracity of application development is growing exponentially. 80% of application code, though, is built from open source libraries. Open source usage is growing as well. But of course, there are threats that come with that. We know that over the last several years, there's been a 2.5 times growth in the number of vulnerabilities that are associated with open source libraries. So there's a great responsibility on both security teams and DevOps teams to bring in or rein in the security environment in terms of open source requirements. We know that the further left you shift into the development pipeline, the less visibility a security operations team is going to have. And this is incremental on a number of different reasons, from just the sheer volume of information that's coming across to security teams, all the way down to just individual teams for development and engineering requirements themselves. So this, this type of requirement pretty much reduces the amount of visibility and the presence that security teams can have into their open source visibility. So we wanted to give you a little bit of a background on why open source libraries are vulnerable, which ones are vulnerable, a little bit of background into why this is important. So you all remember the Equifax hack several years ago, and this really revolved around bad actors remotely controlling and remotely running code within that particular library. There was a popular NPM library load dash just last year, or just a couple of years ago as well, that was synonymous with causing denial of service. And this was a library in itself that was downloaded 80 million times each month. So you can imagine the downstream effect this can have on applications and their development teams, as well as the business in general. There was also an event stream library that was affected because the bad actors actually befriended the development team that was behind that particular library itself, and were able to add in dependencies that then had crypto mining requirements, and were able to steal credentials from that by the more people that were able to implement that library into their applications. So a number of businesses use static application security, or SaaS testing. There's also software composition analysis, which we'll be showing you today, and this is where we're kind of focused on. But for those businesses that are using static application security, I go back to that 80-20 rule that we just showed you a moment ago. 80% of application code or custom applications are built from open source libraries. And static application security really reflects around proprietary code. So the ability to really hone in on specific coding languages and specific instances that are required for that application itself. But what about the rest of that, the 80%? We know that bad actors are going to maximize their return on investment by really focusing in on open source code that has already the exploits available to them. They're able to go and look at what's available and identify which vulnerabilities they want to take advantage of. So we know that this is critical, but we're not saying that one is better than the other. These are all part and parcel of part of your good development security practices. So let's take a quick look at just 2 case studies before we get into a bit of a demo. First of all, these are real life examples that we've pulled up for you. So the first one's a real estate marketplace. You can imagine, as a security operations team, having to manage a number of build teams, engineering teams, product managers, spread out across regions or even countries. In this particular case, the goal here was for the security operations team to have a full view or have that visibility and monitoring capability into their open source libraries across their environment. So not just looking at one particular product management or application group, but looking at all of them holistically. And this was able to be fulfilled by software composition analysis through a greater viewpoint that they're able to focus on. The second one is a wealth asset management provider. So in this particular case, the security team wanted to have better collaboration with their development team. They wanted to not negatively impact that development team by just dumping bug fixes onto their desk or through a ticket, for example. They wanted to have better collaboration so that they could really develop best practices going forward and improve the security layout of their open source requirements. So Chuck, let's jump into a demo and take a look at what's available. Now, keeping in mind, this is a Trend Micro product that we're going to show you, but this could reflect a number of different instances that you might be familiar with.
Yeah, perfect, David. So yeah, what you're looking at here, like David said, is Trend Micro Cloud One Open Source Security by Snyk, and it's a partnership between our two cybersecurity companies. And we're so pleased to show this to you today, especially for the Microsoft audience, where we can integrate, like David said, early on in the source control, where the infancy of these applications are developed, looking for open source vulnerabilities that may be lurking inside those source repos. For example, GitHub integration and Azure Repos, which we're going to go here and talk about specifically with Azure Repos in just a moment. Continuous integration, kind of moving up the stack, right? As these applications are built, we can also integrate in continuous integration or CI/CD pipeline with Azure Pipelines. So we're going to have a little demonstration of that today as well for the Microsoft audience. And then lastly, we talk about Ide Plugins. In the interest of time, we're going to focus more on the source code and pipeline integration, but we do have Ide Plugins available for Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio coming soon. So you can actually integrate that as developers are writing their code and doing syntax highlighting, looking for open source vulnerabilities in that software composition analysis. So let's go ahead and start with Azure Repos integration. I think it makes sense for the audience here today. When we click on Azure Repos, customers or interested parties very easily can add their Azure DevOps account, their associated Azure Repos, and go ahead and test their projects that are in there. We've got this Trend Angel Beat Snyk project that we're going to go and test for you all today. You can quickly add the selected repository, and when you do that, it's going to instantly test that project. So we're saying here in the pane here that project is being tested, and we're looking in here, being that this is a node project. David had mentioned that in his talk, that we're looking at that package.json file, that manifest file, where a lot of these vulnerabilities are placed from developers, and we'll go into that in just a few details here. But in that package.json file, we found 39 high vulnerabilities, 33 medium, and 6 low. And from a SecOps lens, giving that visibility for a SecOps professional to see what's going on in these open source projects that they're working on, they can easily click the View Report option here. And that'll drop right into the project pane, and a customer or SecOps professional can look at the security issues, license issues, and all kinds of good things. So David, why don't you take us through that SecOps lens here, what we're looking at?
Exactly. So picture yourself in the security role where you're coming into this and you're identifying exactly what's happening across your security realm, essentially. Here, when you look down at the graphic, you're able to identify the security issues themselves over time. So over time, you would monitor this. You would be able to identify what's going on, what's happening in terms of the vulnerabilities associated to your open source code and those dependencies. You'll see that at the top we have 38 high severity, 33 medium severity, and this gives us a real good insight into what's happening. So a perfect landscape for a security operations team to be able to identify those vulnerabilities. On the right-hand side, we have the license issues. So again, these are critical to your legal team or managing up to your CISO, for example, where you're having to identify exactly what might be involved in those libraries themselves. Are there any royalties? Are there any requirements we're not aware of that we might have to address in terms of the license itself? So again, being able to focus in on these requirements is detrimental to the overall requirement. Chuck, let's take a look at the projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we start off on that initial integration standpoint? So you got that high visibility report methodology you can look at, but let's take a look at that package.json file. We've identified this manifest file, and to kind of give some backstory, we'll jump into Azure DevOps, where a lot of DevOps professionals spend most of their time. And that manifest file that they're committing in that Azure repo, this is where developers are committing those dependency packages, right? These are the dependencies that they need for that application code they're writing, for example, in the app.js. They're calling those they're calling those libraries, right, and those open source packages, saying, hey, I need to use certain features and functionality based on a certain version. So they'll specify the packages they need and those specific versions in this package.json manifest file. So we're taking a look at that, right, in that test, and we go ahead and look at the issues that come abroad here. So we've got our vulnerabilities, we've got 77 that we found, we've got one license issue that David had mentioned. So, this may be lurking in a open source package that you're bringing in to your environment. So maybe you are not okay with the GPL 2.0 license. Now you have that awareness that that's actually lurking with that package that you're bringing in to your application build cycle. And then speaking of vulnerabilities, we can sort by severity here. So the SecOps professionals can go ahead and zero in what they need to focus on. So, and we give everything in a nice detailed format, plain English, on exactly how this is introduced, what the vulnerable functions are, and an overview how this is exploited. So, Dave, why don't you go ahead and go a little more detail here on what a SecOps person might want to look at here.
So one of the key requirements is that we are able to prioritize exactly what the vulnerabilities are. How do we know which ones we should deal with immediately, which ones we can put aside, which ones we might have to have a better discussion on? And if you look at the score that Chuck is highlighting right now, this is really built out around the integrity, the confidentiality, the attack vector itself, and many different parameters. This is a CVSS score, essentially giving us kind of a backdrop and a quick understanding of exactly what's happening with this high vulnerability. We also have the ability to look at this from a kind of a color coordination point of view. You see the H is highlighted in red or orange. And then, of course, we have the exploit maturity. And the exploit maturity score is identifying that there is actually an exploit out in the wild that can be taken advantage of. There is actual code that bad actors can use today to take advantage of this vulnerability. And that's something that we want to address immediately. And of course, we're able to hone in on this, and the system itself should be able to manage this so that as a security team and a DevOps team, we're able to identify these things very, very quickly in an automated fashion so that we don't have to waste time trying to figure out which ones to fix first.
Yeah, absolutely, David. Like, and what I like is about the remediation. It's exactly what I need to do to make this go away, right? To ease the pain. And one thing I like to highlight to customers is dependencies. Specifically, we're talking about a Node application today, but if you circle back to our Azure repo, these are packages that me as a developer, I'm saying, hey, speaking of the npm package in here, I'm asking for that specific package, right? I'm saying, hey, I want this particular version. What I may or may not realize is I'm bringing associated dependencies along for the ride. And if we notice in our test here that, hey, there's nowhere near 553 packages that we're saying, hey, we want to include in this, but those dependencies are brought in. So it's kind of a neat thing here to see, hey, here's all the dependencies that my code project is bringing in. I need to zero in just on the ones that are vulnerable. So for example, that npm conf vulnerability for this particular version of 0024, look at 3 levels deep. These are sub dependencies that I didn't ask for as a developer. I said, hey, I didn't ask for that, but the package maintainer is saying, hey, for my package to run, to be able to do, I need these sub dependencies. And you may not realize that there's associated vulnerabilities here. So you've got that great chaining effect, so you can see exactly where your vulnerabilities lie, even levels deep. And you can go right into that severity and say, hey, well, this is vulnerable to a prototype pollution attack. What is that, right? Exactly how that's that exploited in the wild. And then what's my remediation effort for that as a SecOps professional? So I have all that at my fingertips.
So Chuck, what other integration points can we discern from Azure, for example? Where can we learn more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We started at the infancy, like the source code repository, like Azure Repos, but you can certainly integrate, farther upstream in Azure Pipelines, for example. So if you've got those DevOps professionals that live in Azure DevOps, right, and they stay in their environment, you got those build and release managers and those DevOps professionals that this is their world on a day-to-day basis, we can integrate here. So we talked about repository scanning, right? But at the pipeline level, one level up, it's going to receive those commits and pushes in the repository and make that build, make that artifact, right? We can integrate at the pipeline level, and we see here, easily customers can go right into Azure DevOps, hit edit, and then when you go into here, this is pretty similar for the folks that have worked with Azure DevOps before or are familiar with them. This is your configuration file, right? So hey, I'm asking for in Azure, I need a build instance, I need a Linux instance to be able to build my application upon. I need Node installed so I can build and install my application. So I'm doing that, and I'm running that npm command to install those open source dependencies that we featured in the repo. Right in line here, I can add an additional task sequence. You can see here in my configuration file, I can search off here to the right. And if I type in sneak security scan, I can easily add the Azure Pipelines scan task in here. I can add my associate API token. That's going to create that handshaking and communication between Azure DevOps and Open Source Security by Sneak from Trend Micro. And we can test the application. I can specify if I know a manifest file that I want to go ahead and test, or hey, you know what? Put it on autopilot. I want to go ahead and see what's in this repo that Sneak is going to find for me. Leave it blank. I can set my threshold for high, medium, or low, what I want to set my variance for, my upper bound, right? And then 2 additional options I can configure is I want to go ahead and send my results to the Open Source Security by Sneak console with Trend. And do I want to make the determination based on that variance? Do I want to fail this build if Sneak finds too many issues here at that high level? I set that where I do want that accordingly. It goes ahead and spits out that task here in my pipeline and even indents it properly. As we know, his YAML file is really particular about indents, right? So you don't have to deal with that. So now I've got that in my pipeline script. And any successive build, like if I do an automated trigger event, I commit and I push the code in, or maybe I just go out here and I'm a build and release manager and I want to run a build right now, right, based on what's committed in there. Now my pipeline has that testing component, that security scan. So let's take a look at one of these events, right? We can see here that this particular pipeline is now failing because, hey, our Sneak test has found issues. Let's go into the job in Azure DevOps, right? We see that same build steps taking place here. We've got our code checkout, we've got Node installed, we've got the building of the application taking place. Uh-oh, look at this. We've got a red mark here saying that, hey, the Sneak security scan stepped in, and it's saying, oh, looks like we got a license issue like David had mentioned. Probably don't want that going upstream into production, right? That could be an issue, high severity. So all my high severity issues are showing up on the build log, everything in Azure DevOps contained, right? And I can easily click these links to get that additional information. Or as an added bonus, if I don't want to go out to the Trend Micro console itself, and I live in Azure DevOps, that's where my day-to-day tasks are, is we provide that same report that we talked to you about earlier that the SecOps professional is seeing. Now the DevOps person is in sync, and these groups are in sync now, and I've got that same report. I can go through the report. I've got those 39 vulnerabilities, same beautiful format here where I'm saying, hey, these are the detailed information about this. This is how it's introduced. How is this exploited in the wild? What type of things do I need to watch out for, like types of attacks that this type of vulnerability is used for in the wild, and how to prevent that? And looky here, like the remediation here, it tells me exactly what packages that I need to update my manifest file. So as a DevOps professional, I can go ahead and maybe go into boards and create a work item for somebody or an issue event, right, that somebody needs to take care of. I can go in the repo and commit that immediately, push it through the pipeline, and the beauty of it is all in the Azure DevOps environment. Dave?
Well, this is really important for security teams to understand. What this is delivering is visibility and monitoring of their whole environment in terms of their repos for their code, open source vulnerabilities. It's also providing prioritization of those risks and license risks, and of course a better collaborative nature between development teams. So just out of time right now, we're going to provide an open source security by Sneak trial for you. If you feel like clicking on the QR code, it'll take you right to a 30-day trial, and we're happy to have conversations with you and extend that as well. If you're looking for more information, please visit trendmicro.com/open source security. And thank you for having us, Ron. I'll pass it back to you.
Oh, that was fantastic. What a great interactive discussion. Hey, I have a question from Philip with Agco, the huge farm manufacturer. He was wondering if there's any ability or monitoring if the open source community might have abandoned a project. Is there any way to track that? I'm also going to put you in touch with Philip separately, but that might be of interest to others as well.
Well, the vulnerability database is extremely broad and powerful. So it does look back kind of at legacy vulnerabilities, obviously legacy open source packages that aren't being used. It's very good for those kind of older applications that might be just in maintenance mode right now versus those more cloud native or modern applications that are kind of fueling and pushing forward in our DevOps landscape today. So yes, to some degree, yes.